All right. 1 minute past the hour. I'll start getting started as we still let people in. Good afternoon, everybody. Uh, my name is Robert Thomas Kearns. I'm the Restoration Partnerships Coordinator at the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration. And welcome to the Dam Busters webinar series, a collaboration between the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance, the Charles River Watershed Association, and the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration. This webinar offers basic information about dam removal. It's not intended to advocate for the removal of any particular dam or dams. For this webinar series, topics, and exact schedule, please visit the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance website at www.massriversalliance.org. We are still adding sessions to the series, so we recommend you check the site frequently for the latest information. Also, please mark your calendars if you haven't already got it on your calendar for the next session, March 4th on dam removal and extreme weather with Dr. Sarah Null of Utah State University. And today's webinar is about the Dam Atlas and a few housekeeping items. Number one, the session is scheduled to end at 1 p.m. Two, please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, at which Mass Rivers Alliance staff and myself are tracking or hold them until the last half hour's question and answer session. Please put your name and affiliation to the chat, and note these webinars are being recorded, and recordings and any other webinar materials will be made on the Mass Rivers Alliance website. Additionally, a special shout out to those folks who have been completing our post surveys. And after you'll see from this presentation, surveys will help provide huge information to keep the program free for everybody and expand the program. So we will post the information for the surveys into the chat as well. So we just want to make sure people remember to fill out the survey. I know people can get surveyed out, but it does help. So now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, who is Emily Vogler. Emily is a landscape architect, environmental planner, and artist whose research, design, and teachings investigate social ecological systems surrounding water, the sense of place, and climate uncertainty. She has ongoing research projects looking at the irrigation ditches in New Mexico, aging dam infrastructure here in New England, and coastal adaptation strategies in Narragansett Bay. Through her research and design practice, she investigates how the restoration and design of rivers and coastlines can help build climate resilience, improve habitat, and expand public access, and strengthen community identity and stewardship. Emily is an associate professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, where she teaches semesters in design studios on hydrological systems, urban ecology, landscape commons, community engagement strategies, and material site-based strategies to restoration. She is also the founder of the principle of Commonplace Landscaping and Planning. From 2017 to 2019, Vogler served as the deputy department head of landscape architecture at Rhode Island School of Design. Before joining the faculty, she was a senior project manager at the Michael Van Valkenburg Associates. I hope I got that right. And was recognized. Did I get it right or no?
You got it. Yeah.
Okay, good. And was recognized as a 2010 National Olmsted Scholar. So with that, welcome, Great. Emily. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Robert, and welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for making the time to be here today. I see some familiar names in the chat and a lot of new folks. My hope today is just to share with you all the Dam Atlas, and maybe for those of you who've joined previous presentations, there might be some new materials in there, but really just excited to share this project and to also open it up for questions and answers afterwards, and just to be able to share more about the work that we all are doing around dams. And so I am going to be up here presenting today the Dam Atlas, but really this work represents the work of a broad range of collaborations that have taken place over the past 10 years. And so it's a kind of honor to be here, but also really great for all the funding sources and all the partners that have helped to make this project happen. I first got involved in dam work back in 2015 when I was asked to join an NSF grant that was called the Future of Dams. And as part of that project, there was a group of, I think it was like 48 researchers from 5 different states, a lot of different institutions. And what was so amazing about the project was that there was this understanding, right, that we really needed this interdisciplinary approach in order to tackle some of these really complex social, ecological, complex problems right now. And so one of the early things that I did in that project was just trying to understand and to map out who the different people on the team were, what the different possibilities were in terms of overlap of our research. And it was really from so many of those conversations that my interest in dams and the work that you're going to be seeing today, that it really grew out of a lot of that work. And so to me, that grant and that work was fundamental because it did something really important, right? It recognized that these wicked environmental problems require interdisciplinary and creative approaches. And so often we try to tackle a lot of these problems in these piecemeal kind of way, and it's so important that we're thinking about these larger systems, and specifically about where and how these kind of ecological kind of systems that we're studying intersect with the social and the cultural and the human dimensions of the landscapes that we're working on. And so for me as a landscape architect, I feel like that is something that we do is we think across a lot of these different systems. And that to me felt like a really important role, right, in this project was understanding where and how we could figure out how to speak the same language, how we could talk about our research, and where and how we could think about this complexity and think holistically about it. One of the first articles that I came upon when part of this project was this wonderful article that's titled "You Killed the Dam and You're Killing a Part of Me." And it was about kind of dam removal and the environmental politics of river restoration. And that title came from a quote in the article that's from a gentleman, from a resident along the Swift River, who stated, "The Swift River has been a part of me since I was a little kid. You kill the dam, you're killing a part of me." And for me, when I read that article and when I read about this sense of place, this community attachment to dams, I recognized, right, that there was a really important role that we as landscape architects could play within these conversations around dams. And in the article, they go on to elaborate, that this was written in 2016, and so the date has probably changed since then. But at that time, more than 50 dams that had been identified for potential removal by state agencies had been stalled or delayed due to the opposition on a variety of grounds. And in the article, they go on to elaborate on what they perceived as the major conflicts. The first being a perceived loss or threat to individual and collective sense of place around the dams and impoundments. And the second being the sense that dam removal process itself ignored community-based stewardship of local resources. And to me, both of those were extremely important in terms of where and how we think about community decision-making around water resources. There was another article that I went on to read by Johnson and Graber that identified 3 issues that led to more divisive decision-making when the idea of removal was new to the community, when a quick decision needed to be made, and when outsiders, such as state agencies or conservation organizations, were leading the decision process because communities often perceived that they came in already with a set agenda. And so to me, by reading that material and reading those articles and having conversations with different practitioners, to me, I saw these controversies, they raised really important questions about how the public should be involved in decision-making around the management of river, water, and other common pool resources, right? So if we understand rivers as a commons, who should be making those decisions? And the fact that we really need new models of what environmental democracies can look like. And to me, that seems like a really fundamental, foundational question that was circulating in what I'd read. And this idea that how can we begin to cultivate or explore new creative social practices that bring people together at the local level to discuss divergent viewpoints, to critically reevaluate history, science, and personal values, and to fully consider the social and environmental repercussions of these individual and community beliefs, identities, and actions, right? So there's this kind of fundamental need to revisit and to find ways to bring people together to have these tricky conversations. And so I saw that kind of in reading the literature, but also looking forward, right? In the coming decades, we know there's going to need to be thousands of decisions about a lot of the aging dams. I'm based here in Rhode Island. I focus a lot on, kind of New England legacy dams. So dams that were built, over 100 years ago, no longer serve a specific function. And so this becomes really important, right? As our climate, has shifted, as more extreme weather makes these aging dams even more dangerous. But the fact that, as we build dams, they often have a specific life cycle, and we're up at that point where a lot of these decisions are going to need to be made. And so this number one research question that I had was, how can we improve the decision-making process to reduce the number of dam removal projects that stall or fail due to community opposition? And that was really the kind of foundational question that I had as I entered into this work. And then the second part, just coming from my specific background, I was on this team with amazing scientists, biophysical scientists, social scientists, and others, and I'm a landscape architect, but I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer. But this question of how can we use art and design to find creative solutions that can maintain and strengthen sense of place, even if the landscapes are changing. And so this is just a rendering that we made early on in the project, just as an idea of where and how can we mark and think about kind of marking the historic location of dams, even if that landscape is changing. Where and how can we think about the role of design in helping to help that transition, right? And to understand that that even if the landscape's changing, there's still ways that we could think about how we can design those spaces in order to recognize those different histories. And along with that, as I started to get into this work, I was also just excited to explore how do we just strengthen sense of place in general around our rivers, and how do we bring people's attention and sense of identity back to our rivers. And so as an early stage of this project, kind of a little tangential, we started working with with Stephanie here on the Blackstone, and thinking about where and how we could start to do community events, where and how we could use our art practices in order to help to build this relationship. And so I worked with this amazing printmaker, Jack, here, and we developed a series of these postcards. And during events, we were using the letterpress in order to have people be able to participate in the process of making these letters, to participate in a creative process, but also have a message, right, about the river, about these different issues that we're looking at on the river, whether it is about the kind of indigenous histories of the river, water quality, fish passage, climate resilience, access. We wanted to find a way to kind of communicate about those key issues, but in a way that moves beyond just a kind of typical essay or typical paper that we might publish. So just thinking about where and how we could use our creative practices in order to just make people feel more connected to the rivers. And along with that, just thinking of how we help people to visualize our river systems. This was a model that we built early on of the Blackstone River. It's a 30-foot model, and identifies some of the kind of key features along the river. Of course, what you see called out in the yellow are the dams, but just finding these creative ways, right, that we could bring more of the general public into these conversations about the future of our rivers and how to strengthen the kind of the health of both the people as well as the rivers and the ecology around them. And so it was all that work that kind of led into what we are now calling the Dam Atlas, and it's called 2.0 because for those of you who know me, know it's been a work in progress, a labor of love for a long time, but excited to be at the point where we're able to share it. And there's a couple of different components to the project. We have the PDF itself and a printed version, which includes parts that are about like understanding dams, case studies, and decision making. And I'll go through each of those in a moment. And then we also have the website, which is the way that kind of everybody is most easily able to access it, which also includes an interactive map. What I would say is that, we have been working hard to get this project to a certain point of completion, but I very much see this as the beginning of this project, and that it really becomes a framework that can be a place, be like a clearinghouse for information for people who are working on dam-related projects. And so going through the different components of the project, these are some snapshots from the document itself. But in the understanding dams part of the work of the Dam Atlas, our goal was just to be able to provide some context about some of the key issues that are often present when communities are having to make a decision about a dam. And so we go over both through text as well as through simple diagrams such as these, trying to describe, right, some of those differences between a kind of free-flowing river, for example, and an impounded river. And then we also include a lot of maps. For right now, the Dam Atlas is specifically focusing on the Narragansett Bay watershed as well as the coastal watersheds of Rhode Island, but just trying to find ways to map the presence of dams in order to help people to understand the scale of the issues that we're dealing with here, right? Because I feel like it's always amazing when I talk to people about dams. They have no idea how many dams exist within our watersheds. And so finding different ways to map. And so I work closely with Jason Parent, who's a professor down at URI with the GIS analysis part of this project, and where we're able to go in and analyze some existing data, bring in other data in order to try to map some of these social and ecological aspects of the dams. This, for example, looking at the kind of head of tide, the first dams on the rivers, trying to understand the dark blue lines is like where can fish pass up to, anadromous fish pass to, and you could see just how disconnected so many of our rivers are from migratory fish as a result of dams. And then trying to bring in and map out some of the other social factors that might lead to more community attachment around certain dams. And so, for example, we mapped where is there fishing and boating access around the dam, right? Because often associated with the impoundment or the reservoir, because obviously that's going to have a different layer of community attachment than a dam that's in the middle of the forest, right? And so one of the things that we were trying to do through this mapping was to untangle this, right? How can we begin to untangle all, for example, within Narragansett Bay watershed here, there's 1,000, I think 36, kind of dams that are documented within within our data set. And how do we begin to help watershed organizations or the general public understand that the differences, right? That some of these dams are just falling down in the middle of the forest, right? And some of these dams are in the middle of town. And so how do we begin to map and understand both those social dimensions as well as some of those ecological dimensions, of which would be the highest priority when we're thinking about opportunities for restoration? And so within the website itself, we have kind of hopefully an easy interface. I've worked with an amazing graphic designer and web builder. And so we have different categories that it's kind of broken out into types and use and ownership, hazard risk, history, sense of place, fish passage, water quality, cost and funding, and then just a kind of breakdown of some of the metrics. And the goal here was really just to help to unpack, right, all the complexity around the dams. And here you could see that kind of the way that it's laid out on the website. The second part of the website is around case studies. And so looking at some of the kind of typical strategies that are used when thinking about the future of the dam, specifically trying to look at alternatives where we are moving beyond just a binary of discussing keeping or removing the dam, but also looking for creative other alternatives, that other space. And so we went through, and I'll go through a couple of these later on, but these are all available on the website. We have it kind of broken up into some of the different kind of, typical approaches, typical alternatives, and then we go through and have descriptions, and then also downloadable PDFs of some of the different case studies that we've already focused on for this document. And then on the website itself, we also go into this interactive map. And what's great about it, Rob and I were talking before about, how so much of our work is state bound. You all have Massachusetts that has the amazing mapping capabilities than other states. But our goal with this is that people could actually search by watershed. So if you're working on a watershed, you could search by, for example, the whole Blackstone watershed, and that it allows for a way to visualize some of the data around these dams. And you can turn on and off different features so that, for example, if you're like, I would like to look at and try to find, where is there a dam with very low development around it that is high hazard and could open up a lot of upstream miles, right, of fish connectivity. So the idea is that, or habitat connectivity, and so the idea is that you could go through and set those different filters in order to begin to understand some of those different kind of factors that actually make each dam very unique from one another. And then the idea being that you can go in and categorize them by hazard. We have a whole different range of ways you could categorize them. And then the last thing last segment, or the kind of section of the dam atlas, is about making decisions. And this is, I'm going to spend a bit more time talking through, because I feel like this in some ways is the most important contribution that I'm hoping this work makes to our field. And so as part of the dam atlas, and one of the original reasons why I got involved in the NSF Future of Dams grant, was to think really creatively about how do we bring the public into these conversations. And in doing the research around some of these issues, and I tried to develop a method that is addressing some of what had been identified as some of the issues previously that had led to project stalling or failing. And so there's a couple key aspects of the kind of overview of this approach, and then I'll get into kind of how we do it. And I'm not going to go into like a ton of detail about this, but also happy to follow up with everybody or anybody who's interested afterwards. And so this was just kind of like the fundamental values, I would say, that we wanted to bring to the work and to the methods we were developing. So the first is just about respecting local people's values and perspectives. So listening, acknowledging, honoring, and being willing to factor in community and individual values into the decision-making process, which is key, right, to any community engagement process. This might sound kind of simple, and of course we do this, but I think that what I was reading, and I think things have changed a lot, in the past 10 years or so. But sometimes there's the perspective that dam removal is always the best. We try to move forward with those types of projects without there being a lot of openness to really hear about what the community cares about, right? So how do we really begin to not just hear, but to respect that is important to the local community? In order to do this, I do feel like it's extremely important that there are neutral facilitators and structured dialogue as part of that community engagement process. This helps to create a space for dialogue, sharing, and learning. The aim is not to go into a community with a set agenda or a set idea of what should happen, but actually to bring the stakeholders in the community into a creative process of exploring alternatives. And that is like the key, I think, of what this is about, right? Is where and how do we start engaging communities in the conversations early on, and to see what alternatives might begin to present themselves, and then be able to do the studies that might be needed in order to go further, right? To understand the feasibility of those. The other part is just helping participants to shift from positions to interests. Positions are something that participants have already decided upon, whereas interests are what caused them to make that decision, right? So a position would be, I want to remove the dam, or I want to keep the dam. And an interest is, I want to preserve history, or I want to improve fish passage, right? And what's important about shifting the conversation early on into a conversation that's interest-based is that once we're talking about interests, we're actually finding a space for negotiation, and that's key, right? And so what you'll see in some of the, we did some follow-up kind of research with colleagues that prime different conversations with position-based statements versus interest-based statements. And we found across the board, right, that interest-based kind of conversations lead to greater possibilities in terms of creating the space for creative brainstorming, for negotiation. Exploring a wide range of alternatives to move past these binary positions is key. So unlike large dams out west, I don't know if anybody's joining from out west, but out here, we have a lot of these small dams. And so there's often a range of alternatives that can meet multiple objectives beyond just thinking of keeping and removing the dams. And so how do we kind of shift that conversation so it's less of that binary and more of a kind of open exploration? Fostering learning by making information accessible and visual. As a designer, I appreciate good graphics that can tell a story, right? And this is especially important when it comes to quantitative, whether that's scientific or engineering information that tends to dominate so much of the dam decisions. It's like, how do we actually make this accessible? And so one of the roles that I feel like I often play on teams is to think as a translator, right? Is to help to translate between the scientific and engineering team and then the public, because is extremely important that we are able to help people to understand that information. And then transparent evaluation of alternatives based on objectives. So the method that we developed helps to allow for people to see, right, how well different alternatives meet the project objectives. And so that's the overview. That's like more the kind of core values that we wanted to bring to the work. And now I'll tell you a little bit more about the specifics of the method. So this method that we developed really brought together the background that I come from within landscape architecture of design charrettes, right, which are kind of these creative brainstorming workshops. And then structured decision making, which is an environmental decision making process. And what I found in bringing these two methods together is that the benefits of one method actually help to counter the kind of limits of the other. So, for example, with structured decision making, there's a very clearly defined process for coming to a decision. There's the ability to evaluate alternatives based on performance measures. But there's very limited guidance within the literature about how to engage a much broader public in this decision-making process. Whereas charrettes themselves are geared towards a much broader community, general public. It uses a lot of visualizations, and there's some guidance on facilitation. But they often tend to be more open-ended without clear guidance on how to make the final decision. And so what I found in bringing these two methods together is that it actually was extremely effective in creating what can be a really robust way of engaging people in conversations, specifically around dams, but also these methods can be used for really any environmental decision-making or any decision that needs to be made in general. And so like it's about design charrettes, it's about visualizations, trying to tap into the sense of place, public process. These are some images from a charrette I ran in Chicago, where we were looking at the conversion of a historic railroad into a public park. And it was, they're fun. They get people involved. It's like, I think it's a way to bring the public along in the design process, right? So rather than just presenting, it's like, how do we bring everybody along? And how do we help to empower people to also participate in that visioning, in that creative brainstorming around the future of their cities or the future of their rivers, which can also help to build that sense of place and sense of agency within communities. And then the structured decision-making process is a pretty clear process in some ways. However, it's always iterative, right? At every stage, there's going to be a moment where you might step back into a previous stage. And so the general kind of format for structured decision-making is the problem framing, which is where you might define what the context is for the decision. What is the scope? What are the bounds of the decision? Are you looking at a single dam or are you looking at a whole river? You then would move into a determining objectives phase, right? What objectives and performance measures will be used to identify and evaluate the alternatives, right? What matters? What are those interests on the project? Improving fish passage, increasing recreational opportunities, reducing flooding, those types of things. And then you move into, like I said, it's iterative. So that's the diagram at the bottom is intended to communicate that it's not linear, but you then can move into this identifying alternatives phase where you might look at what are all the possible alternatives. For example, you might look at doing nothing or removing the dam as the two extremes. And then what are the other things that might exist in between? The next being estimating consequences. And then that's when you go in and say, what's the impact of each of these alternatives on our project objectives? And that's where doing the feasibility studies is really helpful or working closely with scientists and engineers in order to say, what can we expect for fish passage with these different alternatives? What can we expect for flooding after we do the H&H models with these different alternatives, right? So you begin to be able to estimate those consequences, which can allow for you to evaluate the trade-offs and then ultimately decide and take action. And so I have run these workshops in a range of ways. There are sometimes when I run a workshop that has all different aspects of what I just talked through incorporated into a single long workshop. Those are often with a public where we don't necessarily expect them to come to multiple consecutive meetings. I've also run workshops where we divide each one up, each of those stages up, and bring community members or the steering committee into that process as well. And so this is kind of one example, like any dam decision, it takes a lot of time, right? But this idea of like how you work through here, the different structured decision-making steps we often work closely with the steering committee and then the public, right? And so you alternate between working with the steering committee and then going to the public, and then the different ways that kind of you need to develop data or do modeling in order to support those different stages of the process. And so as part of the Dam Atlas, what I've tried to do is to make these resources available for anybody else who is running a public process or engaging communities in conversation around dams. I'm making them open source with the hopes that we can, in general, right, improve the process. And so there's a series of documents on the website that talk through the methods in much more detail than I could get into in this discussion today. And then there's also downloadable tools that you can download in order to use them at any public meetings that you're running. And so these are what we call either like the objective cards, the trade-off cards. And so these are just really helpful at the beginning of a meeting to do that part that I mentioned of shifting the conversation from positions to interests, right? So I often start off a meeting with these cards and I ask people to select, 3 or 4 cards and to use those to introduce themselves and to talk about what it is that that matters to them about the decision, right? Or about the dam or the river. And it's a great way both to help people stay on track. It's a great way to help people move beyond a single issue. And it's also just a great way because it immediately primes the conversation to be a conversation that's based around interests. These are written up and I have on the website, kind of instructions of how you could set up the exercise, how you'd want to prepare for the exercise. And then this is where it is on the website, making decisions. And then you could download, like I said, the different steps in the process. And then also downloadable, I think we now have them as Google Docs, not as Word files, but we also made all of this available as Google Docs. So if you're working on a project and you want to modify them, feel free to modify them for you, whatever it is that is important for the project you're looking at, right? There's just a lot of them in there that we provided, but you might need to develop other ones. And then here's just an example of us using it for an exploratory workshop. Then we have the identifying alternatives. And like I said, this is where I rely heavily on case studies at this point, because case studies are a great way to help a community start to understand what other communities have done. But also to get them to start to brainstorm and think creatively, right? And so we have compiled a series of case studies. There's just, I know, the tip of the iceberg. There's many more out there that would be great to include. But the ones that I specifically am excited about are the case studies that begin to highlight some of those approaches or some of those alternatives, like I said, that are kind of moving beyond this binary of keeping or removing, or finding ways to navigate sometimes these complex decisions around, for example, historic preservation and habitat connectivity, right? So this is a great example. This is a dam out in Ohio, which is not around here, but I think a great example. It was a historic arch structure. The river was having really low water quality, and so there was a decision to remove the dam. But because of the historic dam and the arch structure, there was opposition to doing a full removal. And so what they did was they maintained this historic arch kind of masonry dam. They put a water feature over top of it. So there's still the aesthetic experience of the water flowing over the front of the dam. And then they created a public space behind it, right? So it's this moment where using design and thinking creatively, they were able to meet those multiple objectives of historic preservation as well as river connectivity, right? And so I think sometimes showing people this, are like, oh, it doesn't have to be an either or, right? And so to me, that seems extremely important in these conversations. So showing these type of examples are really helpful. A similar partial removal up in Maine, in Alna, where they did a kind of partial removal of the dam. There was an ordinance that said there had to be a structure. So they found a way around that. They created this viewing platform so that people could be up top to watch the herring run, to see the river, right? So these really interesting ways where public space is also being designed in as a way of thinking about how people connect and kind of are able to get close and feel that kind of connection to the rivers. Damerscott Mills, another really just interesting creative alternative for Maine, just thinking a little bit more creatively about what can fish ladders look like and how might they be able to be integrated right into a design landscape. And then some other examples. This is Nature Like Fishway from here in Rhode Island. Sometimes really helpful for smaller dams. Or bypass channels. This is up in Maine. So just a couple of case studies that, but there's a lot more on the website where just these are really helpful, right, in that developing of alternatives and as a starting point. And then also we have some diagrams that we've made for this project, just trying to think a bit more creatively about like what are other ways that we could think about incorporating public access into a site where a dam's been removed, right? Or so this was specifically looking at dam removal and where and how public access can still be incorporated into that as a way of maintaining sense of place and maintaining that kind of connection to the river itself. So just some kind of diagrams that are just kind of exploratory. So then moving out, once you've kind of brainstormed, we looked at the case studies, you brainstormed some alternatives, then we go into this more kind of technical estimating of consequences. Like I said, this is where kind of those H&H models and those other kind of studies become really important. And this all eventually, and also kind of visualizing the alternatives, what will be the physical transformation of this landscape. And then this helps you move into this final stage, which is the evaluating trade-offs. And this is what I call the kind of decision matrix, where for any project, the objectives are listed out on the left side. We have the different alternatives listed out on the top. And this is just a very generalized one, just to give you a sense. But then you can see, right, okay, how does removal impact fish passage, right? And how would removal impact the conservation of upstream wetlands, right? So like I said, you want to be as kind of specific as you can, but sometimes at an early stage in a process, you can't be super specific, but you could understand generally kind of what some of the different issues are and what some of the general impacts will be. And that's where you could then begin to hone in and say, okay, well, based on this early stage of this, we're now going to move into 2 or 3 of these alternatives that we're going to start to model in more detail through a feasibility study, right? And so there's different ways that you can work back and forth as the decision gets closer or as you start to narrow in on different alternatives. This is one from the Nemasket River, where we were looking at a couple of different options, and it's much more specific, you could see, because we were working with Horsley Witten, and they did some amazing modeling to help us to get a sense, of what would be the impact in terms of flood damage, right? And so they were able to model a couple of the different alternatives, and then we were able to get into a much more specific way of talking about the impacts, right, or estimating those consequences. And so that's an example of like where and how you could start to get more refined and more detailed as you move forward in a project. And then just the way that you could use this in a community setting in order to be able to lay out and make visual and visible, right, all those different alternatives, all the different impacts. And then we asked people to use red, yellow, and green to indicate preferred alternative, acceptable alternative, and a no-go. But that middle, the yellow, is really key because that's also right where we move into a space of negotiation or space of compromise. And so all of this material, like I said, we have the kind of PDF, and then we have also I've published a bit more on this if anybody wants to go into a bit more detail. This is a article we wrote, Jason Parent from, like I mentioned, from URI, who was really the lead author on this, about the GIS work that we did. And then this one is one that I wrote about some of the kind of community engagement methods and some of the kind of pre-post survey work that we did early on when we were developing these methods. And then there's obviously the Dam Atlas, the website, which I encourage folks to take a look at. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of some of our next steps with this work and some of the ways that this is playing out. So one of it is just kind of now that we've started this mapping at this like really big watershed scale, how do we start to now zoom into river scales in order to inventory, analyze, and prioritize dam projects? thinking holistically about where and how these decisions intersect with public access, ecological restoration, and climate resilience. And so this is an image from a project that we're actively working on with Stephanie Covino and Kaylee, who are here on the call. It's called Mishkitikuk Sepe Restored. And we're also working, I think Horsley Witten's here as well. And we're working on a vision plan for the whole main or the Blackstone River. And what's really exciting about it is that we're able to think really kind of in this holistic way about all the dams along the main stem, but also access, and also doing the kind of H&H study alongside in order to understand where and how we can kind of improve the health of the river, and where and how we can also improve people's access to the river. And so this idea of like really thinking more holistically about these projects and the opportunities they present. And so trying to think and develop these methods for how do we start to map a river at this large scale? How do we begin to inventory previous reports, previous studies, and bring that into the present moment? And then how do we begin to understand, the kind of length of this river? This river, the Blackstone, is 48 miles. So how do we begin to understand it and understand where there might be these opportunities for both restoration, but also for prioritizing access and some of the dam work? And then this idea that once we start working at that river scale, right, that's when we could start to zoom in and to start to think through some of the different priorities, but in terms of, which are the dams that are the higher hazard, poor condition, ownership might be a factor, the function, fish passage, upstream miles. So how do we take the information that we started to develop at that large kind of regional scale, and now how do we use that to start coming down to the river scale in order to then also inventory specific dams, right? So part of this work is about going out and actually getting a better sense of what's going on with all these dams, right? And so this idea of local watershed organizations are going to be really the key people to move a lot of this work forward. And so how do we find a way to consolidate all the conversations that have happened up until now about different dams, and to, based on that, then be able to prioritize and say, okay, based on our analysis of the river, here are the 4 dams that seem to be the most important to move forward with in terms of considering what their future is. And then where and how do we begin to map this and think about this at the parcel scale in order to identify where there's overlapping opportunities for thinking about specific dams, but also thinking about larger connectivity of both habitat, but also public, kind of recreational connectivity or different opportunities for people to be along the river at that larger scale. Also working on projects where we're actually just using the decision support tools to explore creative thinking around specific dams, working with some folks here on the call also for this is the dam in Lawrence, this is the Essex Dam, and trying to now hone in and to really use our tools, test these tools, iterate with them. We've been working in order to do that first stage of like, how do we just learn about what's going on with this river, right? How do we begin to communicate to the general public about what some of these key issues are? And so we created a set of boards that are just really about information sharing of what we know right now about these different issues. We've then been working with our steering committee right now in order to develop what this decision matrix. So here we have our project objectives listed. We have our alternatives listed on the top. We're not yet in the stage where we're going to be able to estimate the consequences, but this development of this matrix is the key stage to get everybody on board. As we start to think about alternatives, we've been doing some exercises of looking at these different case studies, doing presentations on them, and then doing exercises in order to bring people into, specifically our steering committee right now, into this conversation of which of these case studies resonate with them. And we've had a couple, this is just from an image from last week where we were running a workshop. We actually had the hydropower company in the room along with the steering committee talking about the future of the dam, thinking creatively, right? We were all just there brainstorming alternatives together. So really creating the space for creative brainstorming, and so that everybody has built enough trust where we feel like we could go there, right? Where we can have these conversations. And so this was a really exciting workshop where we were looking at the maps, and also just starting to sketch, right? How do we begin to draw different ways of thinking or different issues around the river, but also about our cities and our communities' relationships more broadly to our rivers. And then also just thinking about, I know that, at DR, you guys are talking more about this idea of community and practice, which I love. And I think it's a really important thing of like, we're all here trying to address this really challenging problem, right? Of what do we do with all these aging dams? And so, how do we start to support each other in that work? It's one of the reasons why I'm making all these tools open source, is because my goal is that it can help to advance our conversations and that we also are sharing methods with each other, right? I'm not saying that this is like the only way or the best way to do community engagement around dams. I'm just trying to share it as one of the possible ways or some aspects of it that you might consider using when you're working when you're working with engaging a community in this conversation. And so, so this is just kind of a pretty high level conversation that I'm having today. But we've been running. This is actually one of the other Dam Busters events from a couple of months ago, where we actually did a role playing exercise where we had people get into roles and then to use the tools as though we were doing a kind of mock, kind of decision around a dam. And I think what's great is Kate McPherson here actually used these tools, I think just last week or the week before, in order to run her own process for a dam here in Rhode Island, right? And so my hope is that people are using these tools and use it, kind of, we could continue this conversation of what's working, what we're learning from using these tools. There's also a symposium coming up in Finland on restoration that I think I might have sent to some folks here on the Zoom, but this is also, I'll be doing a workshop there where I'll be doing this kind of train the trainers workshop, and I'm really excited to learn from what's going on in Europe. If anybody happens to be over there or wants to come do the workshop or just learn about some of the dam work happening in Europe right now, it would be an awesome opportunity. And then also there was a conversation at the kind of the working group last week of like, could there be some way that the case studies, that we develop a much broader kind of platform for these case studies. And I just want to say that, the Dam Atlas is really intended to be a framework that can absorb a lot of things, right? So if we develop more case studies where, we could totally have it be a clearinghouse for that kind of work, right? It's really just intended as a starting point, but one that is, I initiated, but open to the sharing of this resource and how it might evolve or how best it could be used to support the work we're all doing. And then just, I think this last part, which is like exploring what it means to develop a relational practice. These are just some images from our work in the Blackstone. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do here, right? Is I think that our goal is to shift the way we're working so that we're actually developing a deep and close connection with the places where we work and with the people with whom we're working with. And I think that to me, that's really important that we're bringing that into our work. And I just am grateful for all the partners, on this project and others who have kind of collaborated over the years in order to get this project where it's at today. And so with that, I just want to say thank you all. I know that was a lot of information in 45 minutes, but I think we're going to open it up now for question and answers. I'll also drop there's my email right there, but I'll drop it in the chat. And so feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Just hoping this is the starting of the conversation today. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Emily. Great presentation. I don't see any questions yet. Somebody asked if you could share the Finland conference link.
Absolutely.
In the chat. Yeah, any questions folks have, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A. Okay, we got one from Cindy. How do positions or interests affect the objective? Is the objective dependent on position or perspective?
Great. I just got off my screen share.
Okay.
So how does, so I would say that the objectives are represent the interests on a project, right? And so to me, in working with the community, part of that process is about having those conversations about those interests and then finding the wording in order to develop those interests into the project objectives. And so that is the way that they're related to one another, is that they kind of are like interests are project objectives. So they become the project objectives. And then that allows for you to then look at how the different alternatives are going to impact those interests, right, or those objectives. So that's the kind of that relationship there.
Great. Okay, a lot of questions coming in now. Glad I had a thought. Next one is, when can we have another opportunity to do the charrettes? Lauren asks from TNC Rhode Island and DEM.
Yes, I think there's been interest in doing another one of the charrettes, or like kind of train the trainers role playing. Totally open. I think we've been discussing a possibility of doing one out in Western Mass also. I know there's some interest from some folks out in the Berkshires. Totally open, and I think it's just a matter of figuring out what the right venue is and what the best platform is. But right now, aside from the one in Finland, I don't have any scheduled right now for Massachusetts or Rhode Island or New England, but totally open if there's an interest. And I think we could try to figure out how to piece that together. So yes, I think it's great. I think it's by far one of the best ways to actually learn from the tools because you're actually learning from using them. And I have them all printed. I have all the materials there. So that's my hope is that it's easy accessible and that also those charrettes become a key way for everybody to get familiar with methods.
Great. Somebody asked about sharing the publications that were referenced. We can share that after.
Mhm.
Uh, One Mike asked if he was curious about how the approach may differ when collaborating with indigenous communities. That's a
Mhm.
good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think really important in all the dam work we're doing. I think with every river, every dam, there's different opportunities for the ways that we could bring different community partners, different voices into that conversation. And I think, especially here in New England, where a lot of the conversations around the dams tend to be around a specific historical reading of the dam, right? As this legacy, or the kind of we want to preserve them for historic preservation, but that historic preservation is often only focusing on the colonial history, and so it's extremely important. I think that we have tribal representation and the indigenous people involved in these conversations because I think that helps to balance and to bring that perspective of that there's many different histories of this river and many different peoples that many different ways that people have related to this river over time. And by only talking about historic preservation as it relates to the colonial dams or the industrial dams, we're only forefronting one of those histories. And so I think it's extremely important. I think how we go about that is quite challenging, right? And I think that gets back to the kind of relational practice of like, how do we develop relationships with some of the tribes in order to bring them meaningfully into these projects? We've been very lucky on the Blackstone, working with the Nipmuc tribe and Narragansett tribe, and they're part of this Kitticock Restored vision plan. And that's, Kitticock is the Nipmuc name for the Blackstone River, and so really trying to forefront those ways of understanding our rivers beyond just the kind of colonial Blackstone, or the naming conventions of rivers. And so I think it's extremely important. I recognize that it's very challenging, but I think that the more that those voices are incorporated and that those views get also written up as, objectives in projects, right? The more that those can be measures or ways that we understand what the different impacts of the alternatives are, which histories are being forefronted, right? So that's one way that we can incorporate them. But like I said, it is challenging, and I think it's very different. I don't know if anybody here is from the West. It's a very different conversation out West, right, in terms of both the kind of tribal presence and ability to really lead the charge in a lot of these projects. And I think that out East we just don't have that same, we don't have that same presence and that same relationships. And so I think we need to do it's extra work, but really important work that we're doing when we're working on any river or dam project.
Thank you. Carrie asked, have you used this model at scale? For example, having community consider a series of dams, and how do you adapt the workshops as decisions and interests might vary depending on which dam is considered in the system?
Yeah. Very good question. Right. So that gets to this question of like the original, like the project framing or the scope of the decision. And it really depends on each river, right? What I would say is that in terms of the structured decision-making process, when you're exploring alternatives, it's often necessary that you look at alternatives for each dam, right? Independently, depending on how close they are, right? Some dams are so close that you actually need to look at them together, like on the Blackstone, right, with the Slater Mill and Main Street. But in general, you'd want to focus on kind of individual dams as alternatives. But then what you can do is then group them, or what I call these kind of alternative packages, right? So you might say, oh, okay, here's a stretch of river, and we look at all the alternative, we develop the objectives for the whole project, for the whole river, right? We then develop alternatives for each of the dams, and then you package them into different possible alternative packages, and then see how well those different packages meet those project objectives, right? And so I think that is the way that I have approached it. We did that a bit on the Nemasket with Horsley Witten and Serped, but I think that that becomes one of the easiest ways, right? Because you can't, there's only so much complexity that we can handle. And the goal with this is to bring a lot of complexity into the decision making, but we have to sometimes narrow, right, to think about these alternatives and then broaden again, right? And to think then about the combination. So that would be my recommendation, but I think it's just, and I think every river is different of whether or not, like, what is the scope, right, of what the conversation should be around. So that's always this number one step. And like I said, that is an iterative process. You might even go down the path of like, okay, we're just going to focus on this one dam. And as you go down the kind of path of, developing objectives, alternatives, you might be like, whoa, actually, we need to be thinking out of a couple other dams, right, in order to be actually making an impact here. And so you might then go back and revise your scope or revise the kind of area you're looking at, which is totally fine, right? And so I think that that's part of what's important about this is kind of being open to that process and to where the process takes you in some ways through those discussions.
Great. Um, Allison Roy asked, how do the conversations, the people involved, time invested types of decision vary based on the scale? For example, a large Huck 8 watershed versus a Huck 12 or smaller river
Mm.
watershed.
Mhm.
That's a good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. So it's about how the community engagement works with those
Yeah,
different
but
skills.
like the
Yeah.
small, you kind of addressed this, but like the smaller rivers versus the larger
Yeah.
scale. I
You,
don't know if you want to expand on that.
yeah, I think what's challenging is, you know, the number of dams that we're dealing with here in New England, right? It is just, I come from out west. And so when I first was working on dams, I was like, yeah, a couple big dams. We're like, no, it's the opposite here. There's so many small dams, right, in our watersheds. And so what I would say is that I think that it's actually most helpful to work on a stretch of river at a time. I think it's really hard to bring a whole watershed fully into the decision-making process. I think that there can be like kind of an inventorying and a prioritization that takes place at the larger watershed scale. But when it comes to the actual decision making, I think there's a need for narrowing in some ways. And like I said, maybe it might get back to the previous question and then like packaging if you want to. But I feel like otherwise, depending on the number of dams, it could be really hard, right, to wrap your head and to get a community to be able to understand all of those dams you're talking about, right? And so what I would suggest is this first step to me is just like, how do we understand what's even in our watersheds, right? Which is a process of inventorying, doing the field work, mapping in order to just understand, right? Then you could move into a process of prioritization, right? Of which are the key, developing kind of, it showed like our very first draft at prioritization for the Blackstone work, but like, what are the priorities for your watershed, right? That might lead to certain projects being more or less higher priority. And then how do you move forward then from that in terms of the specific projects? And so I think that there's a way that you kind of have to work it's this challenge, but I think we all have to do this all the time, is like the way we work across these multiple scales, right? Where you can think at that big watershed scale, you have to be able to come down to the site scale, sometimes even the material scale of a crumbling dam, right? Back out to the reach scale. And so that understanding of what is the correct scale at which we need to be having this conversation is key, right? And I think that that's part of what this takes, is a bit of that untangling, right? Of saying, okay, what is the right scale for us to be doing this work versus that work? And then that's, I think, key to also bringing a public in so in a way that they can manage the complexity of the decisions.
Definitely. I think these tools are great for, especially for like the publicly owned dams that have multiple decision makers. And
Absolutely, right. I think the question of public-private is really, or which dams are publicly owned versus privately owned, and what the role of the community is in participating in a decision, right? It's a lot of the work that I've done is around public dams because obviously there's going to be a greater need for community engagement around those decisions. For private dams, it's a very different context, right? And so I think that's part of it as well, right? Is like understanding what is the ownership and where and how might that community engagement most benefit that, whatever that ownership structure is.
great. I know we're coming up on time, so I know we have a couple more questions. I think maybe we'll wrap up and then should we follow up? What do you think, Emily? We'll do that.
That's
Yeah.
totally fine. Yeah,
Okay. Well, thank
absolutely.
you, everybody. Sorry we couldn't get through all the questions. I know there's a lot of really good ones that people are really interested in talking about this topic. So we're very happy everybody has been here. Um, so
Great.
thank you all for joining us, and also wanted to remind folks to please fill out the survey, and I'll put it in the um, chat, and also we will put it in the follow-up email as well as the other questions that I'm going to hopefully try to we will copy and get to you, and we'll follow up on the email as well. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session in March.
Great. And I dropped my email into the chat, so feel free to follow up if you want. Excellent. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
This was great.